He bet $1 million no one could calm his monstrous dog. Not even the world's best trainers dared try. But one Saturday, the maid's quiet little girl sat humming near the glass, and the beast lay down. What began as a tantrum of arrogance became a story of grief, trust, and the smallest voice taming the loudest rage. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The obsidian gates of Blackwood Manor, wrought iron twisted into stark, leafless trees, were less an entrance and more a declaration. They guarded not just the sprawling estate of Garrison Blackwood, a man whose name was a synonym for ruthless acquisition and unimaginable wealth, but also the profound, echoing isolation that wealth had purchased. Within the meticulously manicured grounds, where fountains performed silent ballets for an audience of perfectly sculpted hedges, resided Garrison's greatest frustration, a creature of pure, untamed ferocity named Cerberus. Cerberus was a magnificent beast, a Carpathian shepherd of formidable size, with a coat the color of storm clouds and eyes like chips of amber. He was also, by all accounts, including a long, expensive list of failed animal behaviorists, trainers, and even a self-proclaimed dog whisperer from the far reaches of Mongolia, utterly untamable. His barks were thunderclaps, his movements were lightning strikes of contained power, and his distrust of humanity was a palpable force field. He tolerated the groundskeeper, a man as weathered and silent as the ancient oaks on the property, only because he brought food. Everyone else was a target for his suspicion, which often manifested as lunging, snarling displays that had sent more than one highly paid professional scrambling for the safety of their luxury vehicles. Garrison Blackwood, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, found himself impotent before this four-legged fortress of defiance. Cerberus had been the last acquisition of his late wife, a woman whose gentle spirit had been the only softness in Garrison's angular life. After her passing, the dog, then a gangly pup, had transformed into this bastion of aggressive sorrow, a living, breathing monument to grief and untamed spirit that Garrison couldn't fathom, let alone control. His presence was a constant, gnawing reminder of failure, a stark counterpoint to the glittering successes that defined his public persona. The staff of Blackwood Manor moved with the hushed reverence of museum guards, their lives orchestrated around the volatile presence of Cerberus and the equally unpredictable moods of their employer. Among them was Elena, the head housekeeper, a woman whose quiet efficiency and stoic calm were legendary within the household. Elena often brought her daughter, 8-year-old Maya, to the manor on Saturdays or during school holidays. Maya was a wisp of a girl, with eyes as deep and observant as forest pools. She moved through the opulent, echoing halls like a little shadow, often finding a quiet corner in the vast library or a sun-drenched spot in the conservatory to read or draw in a worn sketchbook. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, her world an internal landscape of vibrant imagination and keen, silent observation. Garrison barely registered her existence, another small, peripheral figure in the grand, lonely tableau of his life. Maya, however, registered everything. She had seen Cerberus, usually from a safe distance, a magnificent, terrifying creature pacing his enormous, custom-built enclosure at the edge of the formal gardens. She had heard his furious barks, seen the fear he inspired in the grown-ups. But unlike the others, Maya saw something else in the dog's amber eyes. Not just rage, but a profound, aching loneliness, a wildness born not of malice, but of a deep, unarticulated pain that resonated with something in her own quiet, observant soul. She never tried to approach, never spoke of it, but she watched and she wondered. One crisp autumn afternoon, after a particularly disastrous session with a renowned canine psychologist from Vienna, a session that ended with the psychologist's bespoke leather satchel being expertly de-leathered by Cerberus and Garrison's checkbook considerably lightened, Garrison Blackwood reached his breaking point. He stood in his mahogany-paneled study, the scent of expensive brandy and impotent fury thick in the air, staring out at the sprawling lawns where Cerberus now roamed, a dark, restless shape against the fading light. His usual retinue of senior staff, including Elena, stood by, accustomed to these post-expert debriefings that were more like vents of volcanic frustration. Another charlatan, Garrison roared, slamming a crystal glass down with such force it threatened to shatter. Thousands of dollars, and for what? For him to tell me the dog is profoundly dominant and territorially insecure. I could have told him that for free. He paced the length of the Aubusson carpet, his movements as agitated as the dog outside. I'm sick of it. Sick of the so-called experts. Sick of the sympathetic platitudes. Sick of this beast defying me at every turn. His gaze swept over his staff, lingering on Elena. There must be someone, somewhere, who can do something more than write a report and cash a check. Then, a reckless, goaded by sheer exasperation and a lifetime of solving problems with the blunt instrument of his wealth, an idea sparked in his eyes. It was an arrogant, theatrical gesture, born of deep-seated frustration. You know what? He declared, his voice laced with a bitter challenge. I'll make it interesting. $1 million. $1 million to anyone at all, who can calm that animal. Tame him. Make him manageable. A stunned silence filled the room. The staff exchanged nervous glances. $1 million was a fortune, a life-changing sum. But the task? Calming Cerberus? It seemed less a challenge and more a fool's errand. A shortcut to bankruptcy for the hopeful or severe injury for the brave. Elena felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She knew her employer's moods, his capacity for impulsive, grandiose pronouncements. Maya, who had been sitting quietly in an alcove, ostensibly reading but absorbing every word, looked up, her dark eyes wide. She had heard the desperation beneath the billionaire's bluster, seen the flicker of genuine pain in his eyes before the anger had masked it. $1 million. The sum was astronomical, beyond her comprehension. But it wasn't the money that caught her attention. It was the plea, however disguised, for help with the magnificent, tormented creature outside. She looked out the window at Cerberus, a distant, powerful silhouette, and a strange, inexplicable feeling stirred within her. Not fear, but a quiet, determined empathy. The bet was made, a gauntlet thrown down not just to the world of animal experts, but, unknowingly, to the smallest, quietest observer in Blackwood Manor. News of Garrison Blackwood's extravagant bet spread like wildfire, first through the hushed corridors of the manor, then to the surrounding villages, and eventually, thanks to a disgruntled ex-employee with a penchant for gossip, to the society pages and online forums. It became a topic of amusement, of ridicule, of avaricious speculation. Blackwood's folly, some called it. The $1 million mutt. Cartoonists had a field day depicting the irascible billionaire being led on a leash by an even more irascible Cerberus. Legitimate animal trainers scoffed, citing the irresponsibility of such a public spectacle and the inherent dangers. Less scrupulous individuals, however, saw an opportunity. A motley parade of hopefuls began to petition Blackwood Manor for a chance at the prize. There was a retired circus lion tamer with a faded velvet waistcoat and questionable credentials. A New Age practitioner who proposed to calm Cerberus through a combination of crystal therapy and interpretive dance. A rough-looking character who claimed to have a way with problem dogs that involved a very large stick and a lot of shouting. Garrison, to his credit, or perhaps due to the intervention of his increasingly exasperated personal assistant, filtered out the most ludicrous applications. Still, a select few, those with at least a veneer of professional experience, were granted an audience. Each one arrived with confidence, armed with their particular methodology, and each one departed, usually quite rapidly, with their confidence visibly diminished and often their attire slightly compromised. One renowned behaviorist, known for his work with police canine units, lasted precisely 7 minutes in Cerberus's custom-built run before declaring the dog categorically untrainable for civilian life and recommending euthanasia, a suggestion that earned him a swift and icy ejection from the property. Garrison watched these failures with a grim, almost perverse satisfaction. Each departure reinforced his belief in Cerberus's unique untamability, yet each one also deepened the despair that gnawed at him. The $1 million bet, initially a display of arrogant frustration, was becoming a millstone, a public testament to his ongoing failure. Elena observed all of this with a growing sense of unease. The atmosphere in the manor was thick with tension. Staff were on edge, wary of Cerberus's increasingly agitated state. The influx of strangers and their failed attempts only seemed to heighten his aggression, and of Mr. Blackwood's darkening moods. Maya, in her quiet way, also observed. She saw the fear in the eyes of the so-called experts, the frustration on Mr. Blackwood's face, and most poignantly, the escalating distress in Cerberus. From her discreet vantage points, she would watch the great dog pace, his magnificent head low, his amber eyes scanning his surroundings with a mixture of suspicion and a deep, restless sorrow. She noticed things others didn't. The way his ears would flick at certain sounds, the subtle shifts in his posture that preceded an outburst, the way he would sometimes stop his pacing to stare at a particular patch of wildflowers growing just beyond his enclosure, a flicker of something almost wistful in his gaze. She never approached the enclosure directly when others were present, especially not the experts. But sometimes, when the grounds were quiet and her mother was occupied elsewhere, Maya would wander near the edge of the formal gardens, closer to where Cerberus roamed. She wouldn't go right up to the fence, but she would find a spot, perhaps under the shade of a large rhododendron, and she would sit, sometimes sketching the birds or the flowers, sometimes just being still. On one such occasion, Cerberus, who usually ignored her or gave a low, warning growl if she was even distantly in his line of sight, stopped his agitated pacing. He stood at the far end of his run, watching her. Maya didn't look directly at him. She continued to sketch a ladybug she'd found on a leaf. But she was acutely aware of his gaze. She began to hum a very soft, almost inaudible tune, one her grandmother used to sing to her, a simple, repetitive melody. She didn't hum to the dog, but simply for herself, a natural expression of her quiet contentment in that moment. After a few minutes, Cerberus let out a low sound, not a growl, but a softer, almost questioning rumble. He took a few hesitant steps closer to the fence line in her direction, his head cocked. Maya didn't react, didn't change her humming. She just continued her sketch, her presence calm and unthreatening. The moment was fleeting. A groundskeeper started a distant lawnmower, and Cerberus spun, barking furiously at the interruption, the fragile, tentative connection broken. But Maya had felt it, that brief flicker of curiosity, that momentary cessation of his relentless hostility. It was a secret she held close, a tiny seed of understanding in the vast, turbulent landscape of Blackwood Manor. The stream of hopefuls eventually dwindled. The $1 million prize remained unclaimed, and Cerberus remained as untamed as ever, perhaps even more so, his baseline agitation heightened by the parade of intrusive strangers. Garrison Blackwood retreated further into a shell of cynical resignation. He rarely spoke of the bet anymore, and when he did, it was with a weary bitterness. He began to spend more time away from the manor, finding solace, or at least distraction, in the ruthless certainties of his business empire. When he was home, a heavy silence often filled the vast rooms, broken only by the distant, mournful howls of Cerberus or Garrison's own sharp, impatient commands to his staff. Elena worried about her employer, but she worried more about Maya. Her daughter, though outwardly as quiet and composed as ever, seemed increasingly drawn to the plight of the great, misunderstood dog. Elena had noticed Maya's quiet observations, the way her gaze would follow Cerberus, the subtle sadness in her eyes when she heard his distressed barks. She had gently tried to caution Maya, to remind her of the dog's ferocity, of Mr. Blackwood's explicit warnings to all staff to maintain a wide berth. Maya would nod, her expression unreadable, but Elena knew her daughter's empathetic heart. One blustery afternoon, Garrison returned to the manor unexpectedly early, his mood darker than the storm clouds gathering overhead. A major deal had collapsed, and he was looking for an outlet for his frustration. As he strode through the grand entrance hall, he heard it, a sound so out of place in the tense, silent manner that it stopped him in his tracks. It was a soft, melodic humming, almost like the gentle drone of a bumblebee, interwoven with a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. Curious and already irritated, he followed the sound. It led him towards the conservatory, a vast glass structure usually empty save for its exotic, silent flora. Peering through the glass doors, he saw a sight that made him blink in disbelief. There, sitting on the stone floor, was Maya. Her back was to him. In front of her, just on the other side of the reinforced glass wall that separated the conservatory from Cerberus's extended outdoor run, was the dog himself. Cerberus was not barking, not lunging, not pacing. He was lying down, his massive head resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the little girl. His posture, usually so rigid with tension, was relaxed. His ears, normally pricked and high alert, were soft. Maya was sketching in her worn notebook the source of the scratching sound and humming her quiet, almost subliminal tune. She seemed utterly oblivious to the creature of mythic ferocity that lay mere feet away, separated only by a pane of glass. Garrison was dumbfounded. He had never seen Cerberus so calm in the presence of anyone other than the old groundskeeper. And even then, it was a grudging tolerance, not this quiet attentiveness. He watched for several long minutes, a strange mixture of emotions churning within him. Astonishment, disbelief, and a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of something he dared not name. Then, his ingrained skepticism, his frustration, and the rawness of his bad day surged to the surface. This had to be a fluke, a momentary aberration. Or perhaps the girl was in some unknowable danger. He flung open the conservatory doors, his voice sharper than he intended. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, child?" The abrupt intrusion, Garrison's harsh voice shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment, had an instantaneous effect. Cerberus leaped to his feet with a deafening roar, his previous calm vanishing like smoke. He lunged at the glass, his massive body hitting it with a sickening thud, his barks echoing through the conservatory like cannon fire. Maya, startled, jumped, her sketchbook clattering to the stone floor. She spun around, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear at Garrison's sudden appearance and distress at Cerberus's renewed agitation. Elena, who had been polishing silver in a nearby drawing room and heard her employer's raised voice followed by the dog's eruption, rushed in, her face pale with alarm. "Mr. Blackwood, Maya, are you all right?" Garrison barely glanced at his housekeeper. His furious gaze was fixed on Maya, who now stood small and trembling before him. "I asked you a question, girl," he thundered, his own agitation feeding off the dog's. "Were you trying to provoke him? Do you have any idea how dangerous that animal is?" "And no, sir," Maya stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I wasn't doing anything. I was just drawing. He came over. He came over?" Garrison scoffed, gesturing wildly at the still frenzied Cerberus. "Does that look like coming over to you? That beast could tear through that glass if he truly set his mind to it. You were lucky." Elena stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Maya's shoulder. "Sir, please." Maya wouldn't intentionally provoke Cerberus. She's a quiet child. She loves animals. Loves animals? Garrison's laugh was harsh and devoid of humor. "Love doesn't stop a ton of enraged muscle and teeth, Elena. All your experts," he spat the word, "all the money I've spent, and he's worse than ever. And now I find your daughter practically having a tea party with him through the glass." He was being unfair, lashing out his own profound sense of failure and frustration onto the easiest target. He knew, even as the words left his mouth, that they were cruel. But the sight of Cerberus, moments before so placid and now a maelstrom of fury, had unsettled him deeply. It was a glimpse of a possibility he hadn't dared to entertain, snatched away by his own clumsy intrusion. Maya looked down at her scuffed shoes, tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of Mr. Blackwood's anger as much as she was heartbroken by Cerberus's distress, a distress she felt partly responsible for, by allowing Mr. Blackwood to discover their quiet moment. She wanted to explain, to tell him that Cerberus hadn't been angry, that he had been listening, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain something she herself didn't fully understand? Garrison, seeing her tears, felt a momentary pang of something akin to guilt, but he swiftly suppressed it. He was the master here. He had a right to be angry. From now on, he said, his voice tight with command, your daughter is to stay away from the conservatory, away from any area where that dog might see her. Is that understood, Elena? Elena nodded stiffly, her arm tightening around Maya. Yes, sir. Good. Garrison ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I have enough problems without worrying about a child getting mauled due to misplaced sentimentality. He turned to leave, then paused, a new, cynical thought striking him. He looked back at Maya, a glint of his earlier, bet-making arrogance returning. Unless, he said, his tone laden with sarcasm, unless you think you can succeed where everyone else has failed, child. You seem to have him momentarily captivated. Perhaps you're the miracle worker we've all been waiting for. Perhaps you want to try for that $1 million? It was a taunt, a dismissive, cruel jab meant to highlight the absurdity of the situation. He didn't expect an answer, certainly not an affirmative one. He expected her to shrink further, to cry, to be led away by her mother. But Maya, to his utter astonishment, lifted her chin. The tears still glistened on her lashes, but her gaze, when it met his, was surprisingly steady. A tiny spark of the quiet determination that defined her flickered within those deep pools. She looked past him towards the glass where Cerberus was still barking, though with slightly less intensity now, his attention divided. Then she looked back at Garrison. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice small but clear. I would like to try. The silence that followed Maya's quiet declaration was profound. Garrison Blackwood stared at the small girl, momentarily speechless. He had expected fear, retreat, perhaps more tears. He had not expected this quiet, almost solemn acceptance of his sarcastic challenge. Elena gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Maya, no. Mr. Blackwood is not serious. You don't understand. But Maya's gaze remained fixed on Garrison, a silent question in her eyes, awaiting his response to her acceptance, not his taunt. For a long moment, Garrison wrestled with a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. His initial cynical amusement warred with a sudden, jolting sense of unease. This wasn't part of the script. The bet was a grand, public gesture of his frustration, a challenge to the so-called professional world. It was never meant to involve this. A child, his housekeeper's daughter. The potential repercussions, the sheer irresponsibility of it, hit him with a force that sobered his earlier anger. Yet there was also that image, seared into his mind, Cerberus, lying calm, almost serene, watching this little girl through the glass. It defied all logic, all experience. And now, this child, with an almost unnerving stillness, was calling his bluff. You would? He finally managed, his voice losing some of its earlier bluster. You understand what that means? That dog, Cerberus, he's not a pet, Maya. He's dangerous. He's hurt people, trained professionals. Maya nodded slowly. I know he's sad, sir, she said, her voice still soft but imbued with a strange certainty. And sometimes when things are sad, they get angry because they don't know what else to do. Her simple, childlike pronouncement, delivered with such earnestness, struck Garrison with an unexpected poignancy. Sad? He had always thought of Cerberus in terms of aggression, dominance, ferocity. He had never once considered the possibility that the root of it all might be something as profoundly simple and as profoundly complex as sadness. He looked at the dog, who was still pacing and emitting low rumbles, though his furious barking had subsided, his attention seemingly still partly on the small human in the conservatory. And you think you could what? Make him less sad? Garrison asked, genuine curiosity now tinging his skepticism. I don't know, sir, Maya admitted honestly, but I would like to try to be his friend. Maybe friends help with sadness. Friends. The concept seemed so alien in the context of Cerberus, a creature who seemed to view all humanity as an enemy. Yet, her innocent sincerity was disarming. Garrison ran a hand over his face, feeling suddenly weary. This was spiraling out of his control. He should put a stop to it right now. Forbid it. It was the responsible thing to do. But a small, rebellious part of him, the part that had witnessed that inexplicable moment of calm, the part that was so utterly exhausted by failure, whispered, what if? What if this child, with her strange, quiet empathy, could actually achieve what a legion of experts could not? The $1 million, which had started as a taunt, now loomed as a very real, very public commitment. If he backed down now, after she had accepted, he looked at Elena, who was watching him with an expression of sheer terror mixed with a dawning, reluctant hope for her daughter's unexplainable confidence. Elena, Garrison said, his voice more subdued now. What do you say to this? She's your daughter. Elena wrung her hands. Sir, Maya has a way. She's always been gentle, understanding with creatures. But Cerberus, he's different. I'm afraid for her. I will be very careful, Mama, Maya said, turning to her mother, her voice pleading. Please, I just want to try. Garrison made a decision, one that went against every logical fiber of his being, yet felt strangely, compellingly right. All right, Maya, he said, the words feeling heavy with consequence. We will allow you to try, but under the strictest possible conditions. You will not enter his enclosure, not yet, perhaps never. You will interact with him only through the reinforced glass of the conservatory or through the fence of his run, and always, always with either myself or Elena or one of the senior groundskeepers present. There will be no direct physical contact. Is that absolutely clear? Maya's face lit up with a radiant smile, a rare and beautiful sight that momentarily transformed her usually solemn features. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, child, Garrison said gruffly, though the knot of tension in his own chest had eased fractionally. There's still $1 million beast out there who would likely prefer to have you for lunch than as a friend. Despite his words, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of hope had been planted in the barren ground of Garrison Blackwood's cynicism. He didn't understand it. He didn't trust it. But for the first time in a very long time, he was willing to wait and see. The stage was set for the most unlikely of contenders to take on Blackwood's folly. The ensuing days saw the establishment of a new, peculiar routine at Blackwood Manor. Maya, under the watchful eyes of either her mother or a stoic, impassive Garrison Blackwood himself, who found himself strangely compelled to witness these sessions, would spend an hour each afternoon in the conservatory. The reinforced glass wall separating the lush, humid interior from Cerberus's sprawling outdoor run became the boundary of their interaction. Cerberus, initially, was wary. The memory of Garrison's explosive entrance and his own subsequent agitation lingered. He would often pace at the far end of his run, occasionally letting out a warning bark if Maya moved too suddenly or if Garrison shifted his weight impatiently. But Maya was the epitome of quiet patience. She never tried to force an interaction. She would simply settle on the stone floor, her sketchbook in her lap, and begin to draw, often humming her soft, almost inaudible tunes. She drew the exotic plants in the conservatory, the way the light filtered through the glass roof, the patterns of raindrops on the panes. She created her own small, peaceful world, and Cerberus, from the other side of the glass, began to observe it. Gradually, his pacing would slow. He would lie down, always facing her, his amber eyes tracking her small movements. The low rumbles in his chest became less frequent, replaced by long periods of quiet attentiveness. Garrison watched these interactions with a bafflement that slowly began to morph into a grudging fascination. There were no commands, no treats. Maya had gently refused Garrison's suggestion of using food, saying, I want him to like me, not just what I have, no tricks of the trade he'd seen other trainers employ. There was just Maya, being Maya, quiet, calm, unintrusive, and seemingly radiating an aura of peacefulness that the tormented dog found inexplicably compelling. One afternoon, Maya brought a small, brightly colored pinwheel with her. She didn't wave it at Cerberus or try to get his attention with it. She simply propped it up on a small stone near the glass. With a slight draft from the door, made its plastic sails spin lazily. Cerberus watched the spinning colors with intense curiosity, his head cocked, his ears twitching. He even took a few steps closer to the glass, his nose almost touching it as he sniffed the air, as if trying to catch the scent of the strange, moving flower. Maya smiled faintly and continued her drawing. Another day, she brought a handful of smooth, gray stones, similar to the one she had seen in the dry riverbed feature of Cerberus's own enclosure. She didn't throw them or offer them. She simply arranged them in patterns on the conservatory floor, spirals, circles, straight lines. Cerberus watched her with rapt attention, his gaze following each stone as she placed it. When she had finished a particularly intricate spiral, he let out a soft whine, a sound Garrison had never heard him make before, a sound almost plaintive. He then mirrored her action in his own way, nudging some of the loose pebbles in his run with his nose, tried to create a similar pattern. It was a clumsy attempt, but the mimicry was undeniable. Garrison felt a jolt. This wasn't just tolerance, this was engagement. This was communication. The change in Cerberus, though subtle to the untrained eye, was profound. The groundskeepers, who knew the dog's moods better than anyone, reported that he seemed less agitated overall, his pacing less frantic, his sudden bursts of aggression fewer and farther between. He still barked at strangers, still maintained his fierce territoriality, but in the presence of Maya, or even when she was simply visible through the conservatory glass, a different creature emerged. One capable of stillness, of curiosity, of a tentative, fragile trust. Garrison found himself anticipating these afternoon sessions with an almost boyish eagerness, a feeling so foreign to him he barely recognized it. He would often cut short important calls or reschedule meetings to ensure he was there, a silent, increasingly humbled observer. He learned to be still, to control his own impatient energy, understanding instinctively that his agitation could disrupt the delicate accord Maya was weaving. He saw how she never looked directly into Cerberus's eyes for too long, how she kept her movements slow and predictable, how her soft humming seemed to create a sonic blanket of calm. He started to see the intelligence in Cerberus's gaze, the sensitivity that lay beneath the layers of aggression and fear. He began to understand Maya's earlier words, "I know he's sad." He was starting to see it too. The sadness, the loneliness, the burden of a grief he hadn't known how to express except through rage. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, the sky cracking open with a deafening clap of thunder almost directly overhead. Cerberus, who had a deep-seated terror of thunderstorms, instantly panicked. He began to bark frantically, racing back and forth in his run, his eyes wide with terror, seeking an escape from the invisible threat. Garrison tensed, expecting the worst. In the past, such storms would send Cerberus into a destructive frenzy that could last for hours. Maya, however, remained calm. She put down her sketchbook and moved closer to the glass. She didn't speak. She simply sat, her presence a steady beacon in the dog's storm of fear. She began to hum, her melody a little louder this time, trying to penetrate his terror. Cerberus, in his panic, didn't seem to notice her at first. He continued to race and bark, occasionally throwing himself against the fence of his enclosure. But Maya persisted, her humming unwavering, her gaze soft and compassionate. Slowly, agonizingly, Cerberus's frantic movements began to lessen. His barks became less frequent. He started to glance towards her, as if seeking an anchor in his overwhelming fear. He eventually came to a trembling halt near the glass, his breathing ragged, his massive body shaking. He looked at Maya, a raw